Okay, welcome to part 3 of the lecture on architecture for Unit 4 in the art history class, art appreciation class. And I realized as I was talking about the use of the communication of weight and the use of weight in Gothic architecture that there was something I really kind of left out talking about the communication of weight in earlier post-lintel architecture. It is in the ancient world, the most important thing, obviously the most important thing for a building is to hold its weight. And then the second most important thing was always for it to look like it held its weight. That doesn't seem like that important to us today because we are used to spaces where the architecture holds tons of weight and doesn't particularly look like it can do it, and we just put our faith in it. But for ancient people, it was a pretty important deal, especially when you're looking at these giant spaces made out of stone. It's got to be a scary thing to feel like you're going to walk into it if it doesn't look like it could hold its weight. So columns were made to look sturdy, and one of the most important things that I missed was talking about how you can see this in the issue of Greek architecture, especially in the Doric form, and especially the Doric column. So one of the things that Greek columns did was they had a form of swelling. It's called enstasis, in which the column it tapers, right? It's a little bit thinner at the top and wider at the bottom, but it's not a perfect diagonal taper. It actually swells a little bit. It gets a little bit wider, kind of about a third up, as if it was muscular and as if it was straining, kind of holding the weight, so that the building kind of looks almost like a living thing holding up the weight. So that's one. Another thing that Greek architecture did, like you can especially see it here in the Parthenon, is the spacing was adjusted to just slightly demonstrate the holding of weight, such as that the spacing between these two columns is just a little bit closer than the spacing of the middle columns, right? These are a little bit tighter to especially make it look like those that are holding the outside of the building are doing a little bit of extra work. And then another thing that all the columns do is they just slightly lean in just a little bit. They just taper in just a very, very slight bit, and all of this contributes to the idea of the building looking like it holds its weight. And even in Roman architecture, even in a space like this, there's a lot of that same thought. Or in spaces like this, they're pretty much about the idea of demonstrating the holding of weight. But when we get to Gothic architecture, we really start to see architecture that goes in the opposite direction, where it takes the miraculous ability of the building to hold an enormous amount of weight and make it look effortless, make it look like it's not weight at all, as if the ceiling is just floating up above us, just rising away from us. It takes that magical effect and it uses that effect for the purpose of making the building feel sacred. The rise of the building, the heavenward rise of the building, becomes part of the content of the building, part of the holiness of the building. So that was an important point I kind of didn't cover, but I wanted to make sure we got to before we finish talking about Gothic cathedrals. And then another thing I want to mention is at the beginning of the lecture I talked about the use of light, and I don't think there are any buildings better than like these two Gothic cathedrals that really demonstrate how beautiful the manipulation of light, how much that can be part of the poetry of a building and of experiencing a building. So we're now moving towards more modern times, and we're beginning to talk about architecture from the Renaissance. And in terms of engineering, I just want to point out that in the Renaissance we have a move a little bit away from these complicated vaulting systems like the Gothic, and a return in some ways to a much simpler vaulting system, to the barrel vault, right, which is a simpler form. And that's partially because the architects of the Renaissance, they wanted to return to what they saw was the simplicity and the order of the classical Greek and Roman architecture. But obviously this isn't classical Greek and Roman architecture, and the barrel vault is one of the things that's also different, or this kind of dome, inset sort of dome and lit space like that is beautifully Renaissance, influenced by classical architecture, but not classical. And there is kind of a beautiful balance in this Renaissance architecture between those two ideas, between the idea of a building being upward lifting and the idea of a building being about demonstration of weight. When we move to the Baroque, I think the idea of the upward lift and of the illusion of a building moving towards heaven returns in a completely different way, in a much more dramatic way, and in some ways a more literal way, right? Where there are actual fresco paintings painted all over the building that try to prove the point that the ceiling of the building is heaven itself. But it is in some ways a return to that fundamental Gothic experience. It's a completely different aesthetic, but at the same time it gets at that same idea of a building being about not demonstrating weight so much as about rising and holding weight in a way that seems miraculous and rising upward and heavenward. And that brings us to the modern time. I skipped a whole lot of architecture to get to the 20th century, but I wanted to talk about some 20th century architecture because of the main theme that it covers, which is the theme of utility. So far we've talked about some of the very ancient themes about architecture, right? Where ancient models for architecture, what ancient spaces people thought about when they started making buildings. We talked about the basic engineering ideas of how to construct a building, and then also the engineering ideas of how to make a building look like it holds weight. We talked about the idea of making architecture that was about space and how you move through space, and about architecture being about creating passages of light and the manipulation of light. But in the 20th century, another idea, competing idea, became really important, and that was the idea that fundamentally buildings are tools, and that they are designed to serve people and specific purposes of people. If you're building a house, it should function like a house. If you're building an art school, like the Bauhaus right here, then it should function like an art school. It should serve the purposes of the art school well. And so these are each fantastic examples of modernist architecture, and they each demonstrate that idea of architects who put utility first, and believing that by doing that, in a way, they put art first. And then I wanted to end by talking about two contemporary architects. One is Frank Gehry, and the other one is Richard Meier. That's right. And with Frank Gehry, I think you can see a lot of the themes that we talked about leading up to this point, but almost kind of like inverted or flipped, such as here are buildings that, especially from the outside, completely defy your expectations about holding weight. They seem so miraculously, bizarrely constructed, you can't imagine how they hold themselves together. They have kind of like a sense of the Gothic, but from the outside, where they seem to rise up miraculously when you're on the outside of them looking. They sometimes do the same on the interior. But there is also a lot of concern for utility here. Many people complain about Frank Gehry's work from a utilitarian point of view, saying that they are impossible to clean and they have lots and lots of upkeep problems. But also lots and lots of people have said that his Walt Disney Concert Hall has got one of the best sounds. Concert Hall is a lot about the way music sounds inside it, and that the sound of the Walt Disney Concert Hall is fantastic. And I think he's definitely thinking about all of these themes, but he's also, wherever he can, trying to flip your expectations. There's a little bit of a prankster side to Frank Gehry. Richard Meier is maybe more of a more serious architect, or maybe more traditional is probably a better way. And I think that I've actually seen the Athenaeum in Indiana, and it's a really beautiful building to visit. But I've also been to the Getty, and I want to just talk about the Getty and the way it's situated on the hill here, the way it functions kind of like Los Angeles' own Acropolis, and including that you have to take this journey up to the top of the hill to get to it, and then it's this ever progressing campus and just the beauty of the space, but it is also